And yet, what I do want to suggest is that the ways that many of these walls are built in the name of stopping or eliminating a certain kind of quote-unquote immigration problem, even while most of the problem that they are naming continues apace, even while in the case of, for example, African labor coming into the north or Latin American labor coming into the north in my continent, even while that dependency on that labor is absolute, what the walls effectively do then is guarantee continued policies and continued politics of labor that is usable and disposable because not protected and not organized. That doesn't mean there isn't political organization. That doesn't mean that immigration and immigrants have not developed a politics. That has happened. So I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I'm only in those sentences was I looking at the ways that the walls rhetorically affect again a particular configuration of a political problem that is belied by the actual political economy of what's at stake. In the U.S., neither agricultural nor construction sectors of capital can survive without undocumented labor, period. They cannot survive. They cannot compete worldwide. And that is why neither the construction trades nor the agricultural sector has any interest whatsoever in changing the current configuration of immigration. And in fact is somewhat distressed by the expense that is added to labor by the smuggling industry that is now required to get somebody over the border. So I completely agree with you about, I'm not trying to suggest that the politics of immigration doesn't have its own faces, particulars, and political agency, but that's not the part I was talking about. I was actually trying to just talk about the demand, quite literally the demand for labor and for a particular kind of labor in neoliberalism, which is a demand for labor that is maximally cheap, exploitable, and disposable in the first world. Because if it's not maximally cheap, exploitable, and disposable in the first world, those sectors of capital have to go where it is, and that means going elsewhere. So did I miss your question? Did I misunderstand what you're looking at me with deep dissatisfaction? Okay.
We have 3 more interventions in the room. Are there any more? Because this will be the last round. Do you want to? Should we start there? And then it's the 2 Johns.
Hello, my name is José Hernández. I'm visiting the Open University from Madrid, and I got the feeling that just to have the opportunity to listen to you, it was my visit. I really enjoyed every aspect of the lecture, and I want to ask you something about the main point of your lecture, the idea of this performative contradiction between the globalization on the one hand, and the building of these walls on the other hand. And I wonder if, to make this point, to assume that there is this performative contradiction, you are not assuming that some of the most mystical characteristics of the sovereignty are being put on in the notion of globalization. So the idea of homogeneity, the idea of perpetuity, this idea of transparency. So are we not, this is my question, are we not put some of these mystical characteristics in this notion of globalization? And that is what makes us appear that there's a performative contradiction between these 2 phenomena of the present. Perhaps globalization is not something so clear for us. It's something that we are going to discover in the future.
Okay, thank you. Great. I don't mind which order the 2 Johns go in.
We can go together.
But you better go quickly.
We should do a little performance, I think. I'm John Clark out of the two Johns, and thank you, Wendy, for a talk that was both profoundly troubling and deeply thought-provoking. And I want to try and pursue one thought. And the thought is organised around one phrase and three words. And the phrase is attempts to. And you used beautifully the phrase attempts to when you talked about strategies and functions. But I want to stretch it a bit. And the three words are strategies, fantasies, and performances. And they're all there in the talk, and they're all there as dynamics in the construction of the new walling. So I want to ask about how they fit together and don't, because they're not exactly comfortable. So strategies are strategies for resolving those paradoxes of neoliberal globalization. They're rational, they're purposive, they have objectives, and they're attempts to, and clearly they might not work. The question about fantasies is then, whose fantasies? You know, the fantasies of paranoid nationalism, the fantasies of homogeneity, usness, and all those things. And walls probably won't work. And then performances raise, for me at least, the question about audiences. So who are the audiences for these performances? Who believes in the performances being staged? Who suspends disbelief in the walledness of life? Who judges the success of the performance? And what are the consequences of failed performance? And I guess I want to push you on the consequences as much about the causes, which is all of these have the potentiality for spirals. You know, frustrated fantasies, as we know, end up in more dangerous places than the places they started. Okay. Thank you very much.
John's much shorter.
Sorry?
You're going to be much shorter.
Much shorter, all right, okay, I'll be quick then. I'm John Allen, I'm a geographer here at the Open University, so it's more likely to be a spatial question this time. Yeah. Like Jeff, I actually, listening to you, I found it hard to disagree with you. I found myself nodding all the time. And I don't normally do that, so I was slightly surprised at myself. And then I realised I was conflating. Every time you said walls, I was thinking boundaries. And I'm sure you know as well as I do that they're not the same thing. But because you gave an overwhelming reliance on the US-Mexico border, the impression was, and you talk about inside-outside containers, all that kind of thing, you get the impression that walls are always at the edges of territory. And if you conflate it with boundaries, you get the impression that boundaries are always at the edges of territory. Now, one of the things that geographers are good about is kind of, playing with space and thinking about it. And they know that boundaries aren't at the edges of territories, even in terms of sovereignty. Just simple things like airports tell you that, and the Wall Street, and the whole point about an international regulation and the prosody you were talking about throws up a different sense of boundaries from a simple notion of boundaries at the edges, which tend to be, as you say, in material forms of walls. Though even in the Israeli-Palestinian sense, where the walls don't connect up, it's not that kind of image. So I suppose my question was that if you think of boundaries instead of walls, would you say that all boundaries are a response to a kind of increased porosity of sovereign states? Or would you go closer to the question that was being raised by your interlocutors, that actually the internal spaces of sovereign states is now more a mosaic which boundaries have to respond to?
Deep stuff.
Okay, so let me start with you because it's easiest to just say the latter. I think. I mean, I think that's what I think was both interesting and not yet addressed by me in the suggestions made by both interlocutors.